Previously on Law and Order.
We looked at the valuation of accounts receivables and how people can default on their debts, meaning that they're uncollectible. And we looked at a simple way of writing them off, but how we can't do that because of the requirements that we have in order to make our recording of debt write-offs accurate and timely and relevant and useful. And so because of that, today we're going to look at the allowance method, which is the way that accountants record accounts receivables and uncollected account receivables to make sure that the information provides all four of those things. Dun 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 dun. Is Law and Order popular anymore? When I was a kid, it was an explosively popular show, but I mean, I've heard the occasional meme. Anyway, you should watch the theme song on YouTube. It's a good song. Anyway, so the allowance method. It's the second way of valuing accounts receivables and estimating bad debts. Now, it is the best choice, but I guess the con is that it involves some estimation of uncollectible accounts receivables. With the direct write-off method, we only look at what is 100% certain going to be a write-off, but we talked about how that has consequences. In this case, we don't do that. We estimate what we believe will be uncollectible account receivables and bad debts. Now, this method is required for financial statement purposes because it gives us as close to an accurate snapshot of where the company stands as possible. And that's why doing this sort of thing is important, so that the balance sheet is not offset by defaulted debts from previous periods. So, specifically speaking, in terms of referencing principles and whatnot, doing this provides better matching in terms of the income statement, and it ensures that the accounts receivable is properly valued on the balance sheet. By the way, note that net realizable value is the amount expected to be collected in cash. So if you recall from a few lessons ago, we talked about how when inventory loses its value and we use the lower cost market method, or LCM, we look at the salvageable value from the inventory after taking into account the money that we've lost. This is a similar principle, except instead of being applied to our inventory, it's applied to the debts that we expect to be paid and the debts that we expect not to be paid. So the realizable value, or the net realizable value, is the amount that we expect to be collected in cash. So how does this work? Step one is we estimate uncollectible accounts receivable. Now, the actual method of doing that isn't something we'll look at right now. That involves complicated formulas and research and things like that. It's also what I guess I'll call a time-honored method, in the sense that it's been done for a while, but it always takes time to be accurate. Nobody knows exactly how much will be uncollectible, but we can take a guess. And over time, depending on your familiarity with the company and the clients and what's most likely to happen, your estimates will become more and more accurate. So at period's end, the value of the current accounts receivable believed to be uncollectible is estimated. So that's step one. So an example, on December 31st of 20 whatever, the $20,000 total accounts receivable outstanding is what we're left with, and we believe that $900 is deemed to be uncollectible. This is just a random example. So step two is to record this estimate. And the way we do that is by debiting, doesn't matter. We debit the bad debt expense account. So this is a decrease to the expense account. And it's supposed to have a debit balance, by the way. I'm just saying that it decreases owner's equity. And we credit an allowance for doubtful accounts. Now, the allowance for doubtful accounts is a contra asset account, meaning that its normal balance is a credit one, even though it's on the left side of the accounting equation. It is still a contra account. If you want more details of that, I mean, you should check the, I'm just looking on the page. You should do the reading anyway, just because, again, this is one of the most useful textbooks I've ever come across. And there's lots of useful info in here. But just to give you the exact page where they talk about this, 425, the second to last paragraph is where they talk about it. So there you go. Anyway, so we record our estimate, and we have debit of bad expense, $900, credit for allowance and doubtful accounts, $900. Oh, we have the pictures. Okay, so after we've made that entry, the bad debt expense is matched with the sales recorded in the current period. So what this does is it accounts receivable is made more appropriately valued at the period's end. So we're matching what we think isn't going to be collected with the sales that are made. And what that does is it gives us more insight in terms of who we believe, or not so much who, but what amount of a certain type of sales we believe will be defaulted on. And it actively lowers our assets. So we're almost pretending we're like we're running a simulation, in the sense that we're assuming the worst case scenario. Or actually, that's not true. We're not assuming the worst case scenario. We're assuming what's likely to be the bad case scenario. And I mean, it's normal, but we're assuming that the people that we believe won't pay their debts won't pay their debt, if you see what I'm saying. So it's almost like we're running a simulation. And then what happens is, once we've done this, or actually I'm jumping ahead of myself, but the important thing to remember is that we estimate what we believe won't be collected. We then record what won't be collected, and that has an active impact on the balance sheet. And then hold on to that thought. Important points to consider are that the allowance for doubtful accounts, I already said that. It's a contra account. The normal balance is a credit, even though it's on the left side of the accounting equation. This entry is just an estimate. It's not going to be perfect. Since AFDA is an estimate, that's an acronym for this. AFDA just relates to the total AR in general. It does not pertain to specific customers in the subledger. So the contra account helps us separate from actual amounts that eventually need to be written off. So it's just important for you to remember these details, and that's why they bear repetition. So the way that we look at this in terms of a balance sheet is this is how it's going to be listed. So we have our current assets. We got cash first, as per usual, accounts receivable, as per usual. But then, since the allowance for doubtful accounts acts as sort of a modifier for this account here, we list it right after. And that makes sense, right? I mean, why would we list it way down here after a bunch of other stuff when it's directly connected to this? So, I mean, this is very convenient. You probably assumed this is how it would go, but I just wanted to show you that this is in fact how it goes. So we have what we believe, or what we record as our accounts receivable, and then less the amount in the contra account for debts that we estimate we won't be able to collect. And then we have our net total. In turn, we subtract this from that, and we have that single line to signify that we are calculating a net amount. That's what that line is there for. We then have our inventory, and then this line represents that we're ending our addition, so to speak. So we're adding this to get our grand total for current assets. So this is very simplistic. This is a very simple balance sheet, but this is how we actually list it in a balance sheet.
Okay, so if you're wondering why there's a sudden change in audio quality, My mic conked out on my Mac, so I had to record the previous part of the video on my other laptop and then get the software back and edit it, and now I've been able to fix my mic. It is just non-stop technical difficulty. Anyway, I prefer using this mic just because it gives better audio, which means the subtitles are more likely to be correct. So it's better technology to use. Anyway, so just recapping, step 1, we estimate how much uncollectible debt we think there is. Step 2, we record that estimated expense using the bad debt expense account and the allowance for doubtful accounts account. Bad debt expense is debited because it's lowering owner's equity, and the allowance for doubtful accounts, which, don't forget, is a contra account, meaning that the normal balance is a credit, is credited. Now we're going to step 3. So we've made an estimate of the debt we believe we can't collect. Now, in real time, the bosses and the people in charge of these affairs will take certain steps to recover these debts if they aren't paid on time. So, for example, they might send some emails, some phone calls. They'll threat legal action. Usually, the reason why we say threat of legal action is usually legal action is not worth taking because it's expensive unless a certain amount is owed. So, for example, if you're a supplier and someone owes you $100, it's not worth going to a lawyer. The initial meeting would cost you more than that. But if it's a couple $100,000, then yeah, that's worth going to a lawyer. So they would lawyer up. Now, if they don't go to a lawyer and they don't pursue legal action, that doesn't mean that you're free to just rip them off whenever you want. They won't do further business with you and stuff like that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And when I say you, I don't mean you personally. I just meant, like other businesses. So after all these actions that are made to collect these debts, after all these options have been exhausted, what'll happen is your bosses will authorize a write-off. So once they've deemed that it's not likely to get the collected debt back, we have a corresponding entry, a journal entry for that. And the way it works is this time we debit the allowance for doubtful accounts element and we credit accounts receivable. So since the AFDA is normally a contra account, meaning that its normal balance is a credit balance, by debiting it, we're lowering that allowance. So we have an allowance for a certain amount of estimated uncollectible debt. And when debt actually becomes uncollectible, it lowers that allowance. It's sort of been used up, if you know what I mean. So since the normal balance is a credit, and we've used some of that up, our debit entry lowers the balance so that there's less allowance left. That's why that's done. And so we credit accounts receivable to lower accounts receivable because we're not getting that money back. And this dash customer, by the way, when you're making the actual journal entries, what you'll do is you'll credit accounts receivable dash, and then the customer's actual name will go here. Don't just write dash customer. And that's done just to provide more clarity as to who's defaulting on their debt and for what amount. And so it just gives that much more useful information and clarity for the accountants and for the business owners and stuff like that. BT dub, bad debts expense, is not affected at this time. And the reason for that is because you've already recorded the bad debts expense with the initial estimate entry for step 2. If you recall, in step 2, you debit the bad debts expense account and credit the allowance for doubtful accounts. So you've already recorded the bad debt in there. And so there's no need to record it twice. So instead, the AFDA is simply reduced, the allowance is lessened, and the actual accounts receivable amount is eliminated because we're not getting it. So the write-off only affects the balance sheet. It has no impact on the income statement. So that's something to remember. So when we write off the debt, there is no corresponding change in the income statement. And by that I mean there's no net impact. So if you look at your textbooks on page 426 at the bottom, illustration 9-3, it shows exactly why the net realizable value is the same. So check that out. Okay, step 4, recovery of a previously written off account. So this happens when you actually collect an amount that was previously written off because it was thought to be uncollectible. Now this happens. Let's pretend that you defaulted on a debt and didn't pay it back because your business got slammed with medical bills because there is an employee injury. Okay, so in this scenario, you own a business, one of your employees got hurt, it cost a lot of money to fix, and you couldn't afford to pay your debts back at that time. We're assuming that you're an honest employer right now. Stuff like that happens. Now, like I said earlier, the companies that you owe money to won't pursue legal action unless it's of a significant amount. Now, in this situation, we're talking about business to business. So when we're talking about business to business, if there's like $100 remaining, they probably won't lawyer up because it's not financially worth it. They will, however, not do business with you again because you've shown yourself not to be able to pay your debts. So why would they want to do business with you, right? But if you want to do business with them in the future and you don't want your record to be tarnished, then you'll try and pay back that debt when you can. So we need to have steps in place for when and if that actually happens. So in this example, let's say that in May of 20 whatever, the customer turns over a new leaf and actually pays the $150 owing. So your business is still going strong. You've made some money back. You finally paid off those medical bills, and now you want to pay back what you owe to the other company. So you give them a phone call. Hey, I've made some money. I paid off my expenses, and I want to pay you back. So what should be done? 2 steps are involved. First is reverse of the write-off entry. And the journal entry for that is right here. So in this case, because we're getting the money back, or we're getting the accounts receivable back, so by that, our faith has been renewed that we will get this amount owing back. So we debit our accounts receivable because it now looks like we're going to get the money back, and we credit the allowance for a doubtful accounts element. And the reason for that is earlier, when we decided that we weren't going to get this debt back, our allowance for uncollectible debts has been used up slightly. But now we actually got it back, which means our allowance has been refilled. So since the allowance is a contra account, meaning that its normal balance is a credit balance, we want to credit that amount back to replenish the allowance that was there. Now, the second step is to record the collection of the account itself once we get the actual money. That may not happen right away. It might happen right away. It might not. You might say, look, I need to pay my employees and I have to pay for A, B, and C. But after that's done, I promise I will send you the money. So when that happens, you've made a promise that you're going to pay at a certain time. So that's an accounts receivable. But then when the actual time comes that you've got your money and you make the payment, we debit cash as per usual when we collect an accounts receivable, and we credit accounts receivable because it's no longer an accounts receivable because we got the actual money. So this would signify that we've actually been paid and the accounts receivable no longer exists, not because it hasn't been written off, but because it's been paid. And note that recovery of the bad debt only affects the balance sheet. The income statement is not impacted at all. In terms of specific justifications for that, if you go to page 427 and look at the second to last paragraph, that part's bolded so you can read up on that if you'd like some more details. One more thing, in terms of actually recording this stuff, don't net them. Don't just do one account or one entry for both of them. You got to do these all these steps step by step. There's no shortcuts here. And the reason for that is that we need to show that the collection actually occurred for possible future credit sales. So we want to restore their reputation. We also want to keep track of how long this took, what the amount was, how long it took us prodding them to get them to tell us that they weren't going to pay us back, or how long it took them to come around and decide to pay us back. It's all useful information. And by recording these out step by step, we retain that useful information. We can learn from our estimates, like I said earlier, make them more accurate in the future, because we have an allowance, right? We're assuming, or we're allowing for this much assumed debt not to be paid. But we could be way off on what that allowance is. So we want to improve our estimates over time. And the only way we can do that is by tracking what happens in real life and comparing it to what we thought was going to happen in real life. It gives us accurate forecasts in terms of what's going to happen in the future, what kind of allowance we can expect, how long it takes for us to collect these things, how much won't be collected, and just in a whole bunch of different ways that you get when you cross-examine these things and when you compare and contrast the information that's provided with what your estimates of what the events would be. So yeah, it's just lots of useful information and therefore no shortcuts. So there it is. That's the allowance method. That's it for this lesson. And that's how you actually deal with uncollectible debt. And that's why we use the allowance method instead of the direct write-off method. So there it is. That's lesson 2. Lesson 3 is coming out soon. I'm getting better at this, but there's still technical difficulty after technical difficulty. There's software problems, storage problem, everything. So rest assured, I am getting better at this, but I've never made a YouTube videos ever, and I've never dealt with half of these software problems. So they just have a big learning curve. But bear with me. I'm getting better. I'm learning. We're making progress. And right now, during these challenging times, that's all we can ask of anybody, is to just make progress. So take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video. All right, bye.